welcome to the last session of the BIBLIOTOPIA Festival, organized by the Jan Michalski Foundation. This session will be about 45 minutes long, 45 minutes of discussion with our guest, and then we have 15 minutes for questions from the audience here in the hall, but also from you, the audience listening online. You can submit your question by WhatsApp or by email, and all of the details are available on the Michalski Foundation website. So please don't hesitate to put your questions as they come to you. The title of this session is Another Way of Living, Learning from Shaman and Bears. It's a nice title. It's a noble project. The human and the wild. The facetiousness of our French language results in the fact that the and unites and brings together, but it also distinguishes and separates. We've got the human on one side and the wild on the other. And this separation becomes obvious when we say that we need to rethink our ties, rebuild our ties to end this separation. And the very notion of nature, when we summon it up, is often in more or less consciously evoking its opposite, culture and humankind. With this title, we are at the very source of the problems that we're trying to overcome. We want to come back to a state of nature and bring the wild back into our own lives, but we're affirming and confirming our separation with the living world. Now that I have deconstructed the title, and before the BIBLIOTOPIA team regrets having invited me to moderate this session, I would like to point out that the BIBLIOTOPIA team are geniuses because it was their idea to invite Nastassja Martin to come and talk about this topic. Nastassja Martin is an anthropologist and writer, and she doesn't stop at thinking or rethinking our connections with the living world. Her entire life is a living example of it. With her, all the boundaries between what we are talking about here, the human and the wild, culture and nature, merge, melt, blend together. And as we follow her in her account of her experience, I don't know if we can use that word, her experiences and her anthropological reflections, we arrive at a perception of the world where the germane word won't necessarily be connection, but encounter. Encounter leading to metamorphosis or even hybridization. I think these are terms that you are very keen on, Nastassja Martin. Welcome. So as I said, you're an anthropologist and a writer, and since we're here to talk about our ties with nature, I would like to discover more about you and your ties to nature through your familiar landscapes. You're going to tell us about that, and we're going to meet a lot of other living beings, humans and non-humans. The first place is Grenoble. Grenoble is the city you were born in 35 years ago. Can you describe the nature around Grenoble and your relationship to it as a child? Yes, I can tell you about it, but the nature part might be more complicated because it's not really a term that I use, and I'll explain why at some point during the discussion. Well, contrary to Mr. Pajak, who said earlier that he had a difficult childhood and adolescence, I was very fortunate in my childhood. My parents were both university professors in science and economics, and they taught social policy, and they decided to leave Grenoble to live on a farm with chickens, cats, dogs, horses, and a chestnut forest. So that's where I grew up, and I was surrounded by social and political ideas that were fairly subversive for the era. And at the same time, I was friends with the horses, and I spent a huge amount of time in the fields with the animals. At the foot of the Alps, yes. What about the wild? If you think about your childhood memories, what place, what did the word wild mean to you then? I don't know if I'd talk about wild or wilderness, but as a child, I didn't fit in at school. I was very interested in history, literature, and languages. But I always felt like I was stifling, suffocating. And all I wanted to do was stay at home, escape, and go out into the forest or be with the horses. And very quickly, anthropology held out its arms to me. My father gave me a book with pictures and texts about the tribal populations of the world when I was about 8. And it was then that I said, this is what I want to do, because they look like they're living a life that's different from mine, a life that's closer to this other world than the life I'm living. Well, high school is always a complicated period. When you say, this is what I want to do, they say, well, that job doesn't exist, so you can do this or this, these other jobs. So I wasn't sure if what I wanted to do was going to be possible. I did a degree in social sciences in Grenoble, and sociology and anthropology came back. I was writing a thesis when the book by Philippe Descola came out, and that was a decisive moment for me. I saw that there were other ways of looking at the non-human world and ecosystems, natural habitats, that there was a way that suited me better, and that Philippe Descola had put it down on paper, and that it was called the anthropology of nature, which was a budding field. Philippe Descola, the author of Beyond Nature and Culture, which was published in 2005, became your thesis supervisor at the school in Grenoble. And he's one of the pioneers who challenged the dichotomy between nature and culture. Yes. Well, in fact, he wasn't really a pioneer, because earlier we were talking about Fernando Pessoa. Fernando Pessoa had completely understood that there was no such thing as nature. One of his poems starts with the words, I have seen that there is no nature. That nature was just a component of a whole. Philippe Descola liked Pessoa because the way he perceives the elements around him, the hills, the mountains, the animals, the trees, etc., is a world full of beings whom we can have interspecific relationships, but it's not that is and Philippe Descola's was a different point of view, a way of perceiving the world and nature. He was one of the first to state clearly that the dualism between nature and culture was part of modern Western history, and it was not something that the other societies in the world shared, and that it was in fact an exception, an anthropological exception with respect to other worldviews that never thought that human beings were not part of a whole that was organized by physics and biology. This must have resonated with the experience you had as a child. Absolutely, yes. And what was magical was that this put words on an intuition. I'd had an intellectual intuition or a voice that told me to go into anthropology without knowing whether the field I really wanted to work in existed. When I read the chapter about animism, I realized that I hadn't been crazy as a child and that there were good reasons to believe this because other people shared this view and that there were ways of being in the world and being different. So animism is the topic the field you chose for your thesis. Can you give us a definition, your definition of animism? Yes? Well, let me try to put this as simply as possible. Animism is the idea that what we share with the other beings around us, creatures around us, is something like a soul, the face that Mr. Pajak was talking about, the face under the face. Animists often have an animal mask which covers their human face, and the idea is the soul, that the soul is universal and it cuts across species. And what differentiates us from other beings is the fact that we wear clothes, our body shape and function. At a point in evolution, species become species. We've got the salmon, the wolf, the glutton, and they, at that point, lose the ability to communicate with each other because their bodies and their functions are different. So we're connected by our soul or animistic potential, but what separates us is our bodies. But isn't that the contrary, the opposite of what we think? We think that we're mentally totally different from, but that we should be able to meet with other species through our physical being? Well, Philippe Descola talked about animism and naturalism in Beyond Nature and Culture. These are the two opposites that relate the best to each other. Once again, to simplify, what unites us are the laws of evolution. Our bodies are all governed by that law, and the distinction between us is our souls. The other beings, animals, fauna, flora, are said to be governed by biological laws and nothing else. If that's true, then all you can do is manage nature or protect it. So that's the prevailing theory today. So when you went to the School of Social Sciences in Paris to work on your thesis with Philippe Descola as your supervisor, we need to think about actually, we need to talk about another place that comes in between Grenoble and Paris, which is the east of Alaska, the Yukon Basin, where you met with the Gwich-in people. Can you tell us a bit about that area? Well, it's not a place I'd go for the beauty of the scenery. It's very monotonous. It's taiga, it's flat, very flat, with these wide rivers, the Yukon and the Porcupine. But apart from that, you're in the forest. There are very few hills, so there's nowhere to get a bird's eye view of things. That's just impossible in that area. And that results in a very strange emotional state. I'm a mountain person, and in eastern Alaska, I felt like I was locked in and that I couldn't escape the animal presences around us who were there, but of course invisible. It makes you, it's a very different feeling from what we're used to physically and emotionally. So you went out to meet the Gwich-in people, Gwich-in meaning people. Who are the Gwich-in? They're a hunter-gatherer people who live in eastern Alaska, just at the Canadian border. Half of the society lives in Canada and the other half in the U.S., in Alaska, because there was no border. And then one day somebody drew a border on the map and they found themselves separated. And it was only recently that the Gwychens, the Canadian Gwychens and the Alaskan Gwychens met 15 or 20 years. They'd been separated for many years. I went to work with the Gwich-in with the idea that they were the last people to possess an animist cosmology that was still very much alive, very strong. So I had read a lot about this, and I had thought up a premise for my thesis, which was completely destroyed when I started my field work, because like all native populations and indigenous populations in the world, they bore the brunt of the colonial process. The largest town in Gwich-in territory that we arrived in a small plane is in ruins. Everybody is depressed. There are huge drug and alcohol problems, a lot of domestic violence, obesity, you name it. And here you came with your theories. Yes, I wanted to talk about animism, and I was ended up on in a sort of devastated land, and it was also a bit like a war zone. Well, that was the impression it gave. For some time, I thought I'll have to drop the idea of working on another cosmology, and maybe I'll write my thesis on colonial history, because I didn't see what else I could do. So there was that, and then climate change has really led to a lot of damage in Alaska, especially in the Arctic and subarctic regions. People have been affected existentially. They continue to mainly live on hunting, gathering, and fishing, and when that becomes difficult, when the caribou stop migrating or migrate in different patterns or in smaller numbers, when the salmon no longer swim upstream, what happens? This is, in addition to the colonial problem, a total loss leads to a total loss of meaning. Even the shaman were saying, well, where are the animals? The common sense tells you that they should be there, but there's no more common sense. Everything has been blurred, including common sense. So their situation is unstable, uncertain. Uncertainty becomes the norm, the rule rather than the exception, and they just have to cope with this. Much later, I stayed there for 2 years, and it was only after a whole year after I decided to bend a knee and go with what was happening, colonial history, climate change, that maybe there was no answer. But then I realized that I was wrong, that there were answers and there were ways to go and dig down and study their animistic practices. The state was hoping that they would change. This modernity, as you said, that they were trying to fall into line with what the government expected. They could no longer talk to the animals. You talk about this in your two books, Les âmes sauvages and Croix Fauve, in the Eye of the Wild. The idea of this impossibility of communicating when humans have become too modern. There's a very enigmatic phrase that Clarence, an elderly Gwich-in, said. I spent a lot of time with him. He said there's too much extraneous noise, and my dream channels are scrambled, and I can't dream anymore. He says, I can't dream in the village. I have to leave the village, get out of my comfort zone. How could I put it? It's created upstream, but it's not really it's a comfort zone, but it's not. He has to take his tent, go out into the forest if he wants to be able to dream. Just a word about dreaming, because I want to make it clear. In the West, we see dreams as something that happens at night that is a representation of past experiences, but it's never an opening, it's never an open door that can lead us into other worlds. And that is not the case for a certain type of animistic dream, which is an attempt to where the soul tries to leave the body, and that's where you can communicate with the other beings. At some point during the night, your soul can leave your body and encounter different souls that belong to beings that are also dreaming. So when you're dreaming, others are also dreaming about you. You're dreaming about the animals, and they're dreaming about you. But this doesn't happen all the time, but it's something that is very important, especially for the hunter-gatherers and the fishermen, because our physical constitution, which makes us unable to talk to the animals, are not active when we're sleeping. And when you awaken in the morning, the fragments of your encounters of the night will guide you throughout the day. It might be the choice of the place where you're going to go hunting, or it might be something much deeper. It might actually change someone's life. For Daria in the book, this was the case. Dreams are so important that the first thing they do in the morning around the fire is tell each other about their dreams, rather than trying to forget them or push them back, because that is what they need to be able to have guidance during their day. Now you went to another place after that. You went from Alaska to the west, if you go to the Bering Strait, there's a peninsula that extends southward towards Japan, and you reach Russian Kamchatka, which is at the edge of Siberia. It's a totally different landscape, isn't it? Can you describe that? Before I describe it, could I come back for a minute to Alaska to explain something? I just wanted to say that it wasn't a totally rational decision to go to Kamchatka. What happened was we were with some Gwych'in hunters who wanted to take me to a place that was about 10 kilometers from the campsite, and it was the dead of winter. And we ended up in front of these 20-meter white spheres. I didn't know what they were, and it turns out they were radars from the Cold War era, and that they were present in all the indigenous peoples' villages in Alaska. There were 2 Americans who were still there to maintain them. And these radars were pointed at Russia. And Dacho said, I wonder what they think about this on the other side of the Bering Strait. What about people who are living like us, and when they go out to hunt, have to walk past the same radars, because the exact same radars are on the other side of the strait. And it was like a lightning bolt. I said, I can't only study this side of the Alaskan Peninsula. I have to find out what's going on the other side. And that explains why I went to Kamchatka. And the idea I had was that in Siberia, the whole system had collapsed. In Alaska, as I already mentioned, in native villages, the situation was very precarious in environmental and political terms, but the system, in inverted commas, is still held up more or less. On the Russian side, they went through the fall of the USSR in 1991 and thought maybe there are one or several native communities that decided to try to get away from the villages that they had been parked in and go back to the wild and reinvent or revive a life that they had lost for decades. Dacho in Alaska said to me, you know, if everything collapses, we'll go back into the forest. So I thought on the other side of the Bering Strait, there must be a similar situation. So that's why I went to Kamchatka. I thought, do these people exist? And if so, where can I find them? How can I find them? And they're called the Aven, the Avens. Yeah, I don't know if you can say the French, the Avens, the Gwich-in. It doesn't really mean anything. These are always small groups of people who are part of a larger community who make these choices. They're not the ones who are in charge of, obviously, government policies. Most of the Avens live in a former kolkhoz in a village and do normal jobs. And they sing and dance for tourists. I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit. And the group of Avens that I worked with was an extended family clan who, in 1989, when everything fell apart in Kamchatka, decided to go back into the forest to live and to stop having a sort of folklore relationship with their own culture, which had been a role that had been forced on them by the government. And they wanted to go back to a more natural relationship with nature. Hunt, fish, gather. There was a kolkhoz in Tvaïan, quite a sophisticated one, which became their hunting camp in a hunting camp in the 1980s. How did they welcome you when you arrived? I know that you developed an incredible relationship with them later, and we learn about this in The Eye of the Wild. How did this happen?
Well, it was quite traumatic. My first field work was in 2014. I spoke Russian very poorly. I left with a colleague who was interested in my research assumption, Charles Stepanov. He wanted to do fieldwork in Kamchatka, so we left together. And what we did was that we first asked lots of questions in the cities and the villages to know whether such a clan still existed. We realized that, yes, such a clan still existed. But at first it was extremely complicated when we tried contacting them via radio through Aven, reindeer breeder. They said, well, we don't want an anthropologist. They had gone back to the forest to be left alone, in a sense. So it was absolutely normal. So we spent a lot of time with André. He tested us. He asked us lots of questions about our work, about our vision of the world. And after a week or so, he decided to take us to the beginning of the EHESS territory, right by the river. He said, I think they have to meet with you because an encounter may be possible. And that's exactly what happened. They came to meet us. And when we got there, Daria's mother, who was 99, died the day following our arrival. Well, that's not a good omen. No, indeed. No foreigner had ever been there, and it was quite horrible. They didn't experience it that way at all. For them, that's the way it had to be. Come to the funeral. And we spent about 2 weeks with them. We saw the funeral. We arrived upon a death. She was the leader of the clan before that role was taken over by Daria. So it was a very strong experience. And this budding relationship made it possible for me to go back every year for the next 8 years. And I think those beginnings shaped the future relationship that we would be having. There's almost a maternal relationship between you and Daria. It's very moving. You don't approach your work the way a Western anthropologist or ethnologist coming to work on a community would. You are working together with them, and that's something that is extremely close to your heart. Yes, absolutely. It should be absolutely normal in anthropological work. I really have a hard time with a certain number of investigation protocols whereby you ask the same kind of questions with very precise samples. You expect immediate answers. I think it's the kind of frame of mind that we should do away with, especially in research in social sciences. To me, it's self-evident, but it obviously is not. Working in the field is getting there and accepting the fact that nothing will happen, that people don't necessarily want to speak to you immediately. It's giving other people the opportunity to spend time with you, to be silent. You have to be naive. It's okay. It's not a problem. And people, little by little, come to you. They approach you of their own volition, and they tell you when they decide to do so the reasons why they're experiencing what they are experiencing. That's extremely important. And that's also at the base of anthropology, there's the idea to You come with all sorts of cultural assumptions. And sometimes they go very far. They're dogmas that you've internalized to the point where you think it's reality, and your entire work at first is to do away with those so you can open yourself to these other people and to understand that what they're saying is not necessarily symbolical in nature. They're saying what they're saying because for them it's true. And that takes time. It requires being porous, in a sense. It's something that all anthropologists experience. It's not necessarily something that they verbalize. You need to decide how far you want to go with this porosity, and you've got to decide when you want to come back. The separation between human, non-human, the human and the wild, all the beings that you've studied during your field work, which is the object of your first thesis, Les âmes sauvages. You are going to experience physically, intimately, violently their vulnerability, and even their end. It'll be at the heart of the forest in Kamchatka. When you've decided to leave alone before the others, you encounter a bear. He attacks you. He bites part of your face, bites your leg. You manage to hit him. It's a fight for your life, fight for your lives, and yet both of you survive. And it's in the hours that follow this fight that your book In the Eye of the Wild opens. I'll let you read this excerpt from your book that was just published by Vertical.
Automne. L'ours est parti depuis plusieurs heures maintenant et moi j'attends que la brume se
Autumn.
passe. La steppe est rouge, les mains
The
sont
bear
rouges,
left some hours ago now, and I am waiting for the mist to lift. The steppe is red, my hands are red, face swollen, gashed, unrecognizable. As in the time of mist, obscurity reigns. I am this blurred figure, features subsumed beneath the open, gulfs in my face slicked over with internal tissue, fluid, and blood. It is a birth, for it is manifestly not a death. Around me, wads of brown hair stiffened by dried blood litter the ground, proof of the recent combat. For 8 hours, perhaps more, I've been hoping a Russian army helicopter will break through the fog to come and find me. I made a tourniquet for my leg with my rucksack strap when the bear took off, and Nikolai helped bandage my face when he reached me. He emptied our precious supply of spirit over my head. I ran down my cheek along with the tears and blood. Then he left me. He took my little fieldwork Alcatel to call the emergency services from the spur of an outcrop, thinking inevitably of the patchy network, the ancient phone, the far-off mass, praying they would all hold up because all around rise the volcanoes that only a few moments earlier fitted our freedom, now mark out our prison. So that's the first page of Croix au Fauve, In the Eye of the Wild. Are you okay? I don't really like reading my own work. Well, thank you for reading this first page. This novel has been very popular since its publication a year and a half ago. In the Eye of the Wild narrates your experience and the path ever since that day in August 2015 when you didn't die, you were reborn. How do you integrate this event to your intimate and intellectual pathway? What meaning do you give to it? It's at the heart of this book, which deals with a whole slew of other topics, your physical reconstruction, what it means to be a daughter, a mother, the power of writing, the care that can be given violently or softly, depending on the places, the instrumentalization of a being with all his vulnerability. And given the topic that we're dealing with today, shaman and bears, I suggest that we stick to this encounter for now between you and the bear. You wait more than 130 pages before recounting this encounter with the bear. Why is that? Well, I guess the way I structured the narrative is like a dream. It's not linear. There's no frame. I really wanted there to be comings and goings between my experience during the day and my experience during the night, and I wanted this linear time frame to explode. That's something that we experience internally when you think about the meaning of your life. They're fragments. Here, there, and everywhere. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that you try to fit, and you want to have those different pieces resonate. It's not something that I really did intentionally. It's something that just came to me spontaneously. I didn't necessarily want to follow the rules of conventional anthropological work. I wanted to stay as close as possible to what was happening inside me, within me. The issue of the bear as a symbol of the wild. One of the things that I try to tell in this book is that I spent about 15 years of my life documenting types of relationships with these other beings, especially these big predators. These are beings who hear you, who listen to you, who dream about you, with whom you can sometimes establish a dialogue, but not always, who you can kill. And this was something that I was very aware of when I got to Kamchatka, because I had already worked with animist communities. What happened during the work in the field, there was this forest, there was this family clan. They embodied everything I'd always dreamed of in terms of fieldwork. They'd chosen this life themselves. They were living this life without any shackles. They had this dialogue with other beings on a daily basis. So I was extremely happy when I got there. But I was overwhelmed, not by categories, because there are more than categories, but by the relationship modes that I was studying. And I started dreaming. There's the issue of dreams, dreaming of bears, and I experienced what they were experiencing every night, except that in my case, I experienced it even more accurately because I was outside the comfort zone that you don't want to be in if you want to dream. So in a sense, I was thinking, well, I'm like a receptor. I'm far away from my family. I had no phone connection, no internet connection. I had made myself very vulnerable, and that allowed a high degree of porosity. And I started having all these dreams. All these dreams came to me. Again, there's nothing spiritual or mystical about what I'm telling. It's 15 years of studies, and what I tried telling in this book is that researchers are not almighty. We're not able to do field work and then write about our field work entirely objectively. There's the risk of not coming back. There's the risk that you will be seized by this other world you are working on. It's a major risk, and it's not necessarily something that we talk about when in actual fact it's something that's of utmost importance in the world of research. I'm resorting to literature. Well, in actual fact, there was no other possibility for me to do so. I had no other means to do so. How could I tell this story if not through literature? Literature is the only conduit to do so. If I had done so in an academic form, people would have laughed at me. Rethinking our relationship to nature, to the wild, that's a beautiful formula. But when we read your book, we realize that the reality is much harsher than this. It's something that you need to experience, and it can be extremely violent. It can also lose its entire meaning because you are going to become the woman bear. You spoke about porosity, but you became a hybrid. How can your experience shed light on the topic of this dialogue? Well, I think the book also speaks about a journey. The idea was to try and understand the codes and the categories which we impose on an experience, which is inconceivable. In France, I was told things about what I was that just didn't work. I didn't feel I belonged in this place. And when I returned to Kamchatka, thinking they understand what happened to me, they know it's an encounter, they know it's premeditated, that I'd been working for 15 years on these interspecific relationships, and there's the issue of dreams. I will be returning to Kamchatka to give meaning to this encounter. And then once I got there, I realized that I had this label on me. I was a Mietka. I was a woman bear, and that didn't suit me more than all the rest. It was their way of putting me in a box, of categorizing me. That was the way they could relate to me, and the book tells about the process. There's a researcher who tries to highlight the way an event that is inconceivable, that is extraordinary. In the end, there's no right answer, there's no real solution. You realize, at least I think you realize, that this issue is extremely complicated. Understanding what happened is extremely complicated. What are all the threads that are woven in this kind of an interaction? I myself don't have an answer. What I wanted to do was to open things as much as possible and look and see that there's no dogmatic answer, that it is multifaceted. Well, there are several worlds, and you're in between several worlds. Isn't that it? Yes, absolutely. There's this notion that you live in the frontier,
c'est OK de ne pas savoir, en fait.
And that it's okay not to know.
Exactement de quel côté
It's okay not to know on which side you are. And once again, it all boils down to the work of the anthropologist. That's exactly the space that we should inhabit. You have this experience, these experiences, you've thought about it. What do you think about rethinking our relationship to nature and to the wild?
De cette idée que la nature nous serait extérieure
naturalism,
et que donc en fait
there's the idea that nature is outside us, and that there's no other relationship possible except contemplation, protection, conservation. But we're not sufficiently equipped to face the environmental changes that are there and that are transforming these areas. Nature has exploded and has exploded long ago. COVID is an example that epitomizes how human beings think they're outside of nature. Myths and animistic stories tell you about beings, animals in particular, that we were supposed to understand in a way, who do unexpected things, who become unexpected things, who are more than what we expect, and who make us stray from our track. We need to change the way we conceive of them. These people who live in daily contact with their environment, how given animal helped me reposition myself as a human. I think that it's very important to give a voice in the media, but also in the world of politics, to these communities. They're at the front line of environmental change, and they've been wondering for a long time how they could make do with nature, which is no longer nature, which overwhelms them entirely. We have to highlight the issue of hybridization between beings. It's not that it's already been conceived by these societies. It's at the heart of their mythology. That's what their myths are about. We have hybrid beings who become something else, who change. The current environmental crisis, according to me, allows us to update all these stories. And if we take a step aside, we're not all going to become animists, but if we take one step aside, we could maybe invent new relationships to the world. Maybe to finish, the English speakers following us have been able to follow your reading through Sophie Lewis's translation. The English version will be published in November. I'd like to know what you think about the title chosen in English, In the Eye of the Wild. Well, from a very practical point of view, The French title, Croire au fauve, is extremely complicated because fauve is very specific to the French language. It works very well in French. It may sound a little strange for an anthropologist to start a title with croire, to believe. Fauve has gone beyond its own meaning. It means wild beast. It has to do, it's something that's a threat, that is very dark, but it's being used in many different fields. It can characterize boars, lions, bears, amongst many different animals. The word fauve does not translate in English, and so we wondered what to do with it. In the Eye of the Wild, there's the notion of gaze. What we share with all other beings is a soul. We all have a soul. The soul is reflected in one's face, and in the animist world, it is reflected in one's gaze, through one's eyes. So coming face to face, a one-on-one encounter is, first of all, two pairs of eyes that meet. You look at your soul in the mirror that is constituted by the eyes of the other. And without this other gaze, which is not necessarily human, you are not human. And in some cases, it can be intolerable, which is the case with your encounter with a bear. You're told that it's because you looked at the bear that he attacked you. Yes, it's the myth of Medusa. And to come back to the title in English, In the Eye of the Wild, I find very interesting because it's a subversion of the word wild. What's wild is what's outside us. It's external to us. It's what doesn't look at us. The look of the wilderness on humankind does not exist. And in the Eye of the Wild is a way of using wild from the point of view of animistic cosmology. It's what we said a while ago with Pessoa's poem. There's not a whole, there are only parts of the whole. We can take this seriously. We can deconstruct the word wild. There are several gazes. There's not one single uniform gaze. And we give it back to the animistic powers that embody it. And there's the opportunity it has to turn humankind upside down. Thank you. I'll turn to the room to see whether there are any questions. If so, there is a roving. There does not seem to be any questions from the floor, but I have plenty more, if you don't have any. There's the role of writing. Your writing is hybrid. You haven't adopted a classical style, which is usually the case with a first novel. That's your second novel. What usually happens in anthropological terms? In reality, my writing is different from Descola's second book. There was a sense of emergency in my writing. It's surgical writing, in a sense, short sentences. I wanted it to be very accurate, very concise. I wanted to go straight to the point. I wanted to enter in resonance with something
Sinon, en fait,
that is
ce qui est assez bizarre, c'est que ce livre reste
hardly
quelque part dans
tangible.
la tradition du
This
deuxième livre.
book,
C'est
I
juste
think,
avec le curseur poussé un peu
follows
plus.
the tradition of a second book.
Oui, mais il est au jeu aussi dans les lances du crépuscule.
Descola doesn't
Le principe du deuxième
is not
livre,
a
en fait, c'est que,
first-person
en gros,
narrator. Is he?
vous avez formalisé
Yes, he is.
votre ethnographie et puis
You
vos
formalized your
thèses
ethnography.
comparatives qui en
You
découlent, et puis
have,
que, en fait, dans le deuxième livre, on
comparative
va s'accorder la
thesis.
possibilité de
And in
revenir
your second
sur
book,
les conditions de
you
production
try
des
to
savoirs
go
qui ont
revisit
été,
the conditions in which you
partagés dans le
produced
premier livre.
the
C'est-à-dire,
knowledge that
comment
was
ça
shared
s'est
through your
passé,
first
c'était quoi
book,
les conditions
how
de
it
la
happened,
rencontre,
what were the
qui
conditions of the
étaient ces gens par
encounter,
rapport à
who were
moi,
these
et puis
people
d'ailleurs,
as opposed to
peut-être que je vais
me.
pouvoir les décrire de
And
manière
in
un peu
actual fact,
plus,
maybe I will be able to describe them
un peu plus littéraire,
in
on va pouvoir ressentir
more
les
literary
choses, en fait.
way.
ça, c'est un type
Maybe
d'écriture
it
qui,
will make people
malheureusement,
feel
en
something, and
anthropologie,
that's the
voilà,
kind
qui
of
reste
writing
confiné,
that
à ce
is fairly
deuxième
rare in
livre où, en gros, on
anthropology.
s'épanche.
It's usually
Voilà, on s'épanche.
reserved.
Et je pense que c'est
It's
une énorme
usually
erreur, en fait.
what happens with the second book,
et je pense
which
qu'il faut-
I find is a bit of a
faudrait,
shame.
réussir à tenir ensemble
I
des
think
questions analytiques,
we should
conceptuelles,
take conceptual and analytic
historiographiques avec
questions,
la littérature, en fait, avec l'idée que
merge them
une
with
description
literature.
ethnographique, de toute façon,
An
c'est forcément de la littérature.
ethnographic
pourquoi se
description
cantonner à
is
une
literature.
écriture face à laquelle le lecteur ne peut rien
So
ressentir,
why
plutôt que de
write
l'écrire de manière
in
à
an
ce que,
objective
même si le
way
lecteur est très
where the
loin,
reader can't feel anything?
par effet de résonance, il va pouvoir être
There's
touché,
resonance, and
par
readers
quelque chose.
can
Et
be
encore une
moved
fois,
by the
si
things
on est
they
d'accord pour
read.
dire que le but des sciences sociales,
If
c'est quand même
the point of social
de
sciences
changer le monde,
is to change the world, if we can agree on that, then we need to move as many people as possible, and literature is a means, it's a tools that enable us to do so. It must
c'est bien plus que dialoguer,
dialogue,
refuser, en
more
fait,
than
dans les
dialogue.
modes de
It
restitution
must
que nous, depuis les sciences sociales,
be
on a.
used in social sciences as a means.
Maybe we could mention another text of which you signed the preface. Anna Singh's Friction, an interesting example of hybrid literature, published in 2005 in the US and for the first time in French in 2020. Once again, we find the same theme, friction, a border zone, a boundary zone where there's friction between two worlds. So that's a book you can read, and then the book that you published in 2016, Croire au Fauve, published in 2019, soon to be published in English under the title In the Eye of the Wild, translated by Sophie Lewis. And there's another book that hasn't been published, but it's coming out in autumn. Thank you also to Star Pirot and Alia Rahal, who have provided us with simultaneous interpretation into English, and thank you to all our guests and audience.
Merci.